Battle lines are drawn in the American Revolution. On one side, soldiers from the most powerful empire on the planet.
The British were much better armed, much better disciplined, and they were prepared to fight a full-scale battle.
On the other side, a collection of fishermen, farmers, and seafaring merchants.
They had no real army, they had no navy, they had no experience in revolutions.
The leader of this ragged band of troops is a prosperous Virginia landowner, George Washington.
Wherever Washington goes, he's exposed to the elements. The weather is a force in Washington's life. He is in awe of the atmosphere.
Part of Washington's brilliance as a commander was his ability to surprise the British by not obeying that schedule dictated by the weather.
On this episode of When Weather Changed History, how superior knowledge of the climate in the New World helped defeat an empire and give birth to a nation.
If you review the Revolutionary War year by year, there's almost always a fascinating story about the weather and its impact, sometimes a decisive impact, on a battle.
In 1776, the whole fate of the army and of the war and of the country was literally in the wind.
In July of 1775, Commander George Washington arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take the reins of the colony's rebel army. Washington had served as an officer with the British Army during the French and Indian War. Now he's taking up arms against his former comrades who rule the American colonies.
He had had a distinguished record as a soldier. He'd been a very able officer, but he'd never commanded an army in battle before in his life.
Resentment against Britain's King George III had been brewing for years. It came to a head in 1773 at the Boston Tea Party, when colonists rebelled against unfair taxation. The Continental Congress has not yet decided to break from England, but their disagreements with the Crown have recently erupted into battles at Lexington and Concord. Washington's troops are paid volunteers, mostly colonial militiamen. They have little military training and are short on gunpowder and muskets. But they are on familiar ground. They know the territory and the weather that comes with it.
Most of the army under George Washington were farmers. Washington himself was a farmer.
The colonists spent much of their time outdoors. The weather is a force that is always there. They did have the benefit of being more familiar with the weather conditions and also being more accustomed to the terrain.
They sort of live by what we kind of think of now as the old farmer's almanac kind of weather, the reading the skies. There were certain sort of telltale signs, a halo around the moon, indicative of sort of a middle or high cloud layer that would often foretell of an approaching storm.
Throughout his life, Washington made a careful study of air temperature, wind direction, and humidity at his estate in Virginia. He kept daily records of his findings.
Last evening and night being soft, no frost today, little or no wind, clear and exceedingly pleasant.
He is in awe of the atmosphere and the forces of the universe, and that he wants to understand them.
His knowledge is about to be put to the test in the hills surrounding Boston. As the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, George Washington's mission is to contain the British who have occupied Boston.
American forces were trying to hold them there, to keep them from coming inland, but also, at best, to drive them out of Boston.
The 43-year-old general spent the first few months of his commission selecting officers and organizing his troops. Washington's army doesn't have the firepower to take on the British. But a young Boston bookseller named Henry Knox has an idea and requests a few minutes of the commander's time.
General Washington.
Knox's plan is to lead a group of men on an ambitious 300-mile trip from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. There, they will round up more than 40 cannons and other artillery and bring it all back to Boston to use against the British. Washington approves the plan.
Thank you, sir.
A cold New England winter is closing in.
The weather was pretty harsh, more harsh in the Northeast than in England. The colds were colder, the snows were more frequent.
Traditionally, European armies lay low during the winter months.
We see that the British really were playing by a conventional rule book that said in the winter you hunker down, and then after the snows have thawed and the roads have dried up in the late spring, then you begin the military campaigning season.
Washington knows the British expect the rebels to follow the same schedule. That makes Knox's plan even more ingenious. In November of 1775, while the British are comfortably encamped in Boston, Knox and 2 other men head to Fort Ticonderoga. The journey takes about 3 weeks. At the fort, guns and cannons are packed up and shuttled to boats on the northern shore of Lake George. From here on out, the success of the mission is entirely dependent on the weather. The temperature on December 9th is above freezing as the boats set out carrying the artillery. Knox knows the mild weather won't last, and the precious cargo must make the trip down the lake before it ices over. To his relief, the guns reach the southern shore before the surface freezes. The next part of the expedition will be over land.
The problem was that it was winter, and there were no roads. There was no Massachusetts Turnpike. They were going to move these guns at more than 300 miles. Knox saw that as an opportunity, the opportunity of snow and ice. Move the guns on sleds, not on wagons.
Knox recruits local workers to build 40 giant sleds and hires 80 oxen to pull them while he and his men watch for snow.
Along came a blizzard, and the snow was very deep.
Moving the heavy load over the deep snow is difficult, but not nearly as hard as pulling wagons over muddy roads. On January 2nd, 1776, Knox's men guide the artillery downhill to the frozen banks of the Hudson River. But the ice isn't thick enough to support the heaviest cannons. 3 days later, on January 5th, Knox writes to General Washington.
Now a cruel thaw hinders from crossing Hudson River.
A cold snap around the 7th makes the ice hard enough to move the cannons. By January 9th, the sleds set out again from Albany. For the next 2 weeks, the men struggle to cross another 100 miles over land. They finally reach Cambridge, Massachusetts on January 24th. The movement of the weapons goes completely unnoticed by the British troops.
Those guns were brought during the winter, when the British least expected that the Americans would be so industrious.
Even so, driving the British out of Boston would be far easier said than done for the rebels.
They had no experience in revolutions. They were young, and the country had very little money. They were improvising the whole time.
With the odds stacked against him, George Washington comes up with an audacious plan. He will take advantage of geography and the element of surprise. While the British had spent early 1776 resting up in Boston, the rebels had been secretly transporting artillery across hundreds of miles of frozen land to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, in late winter, George Washington launches a bold plan. Under the cover of darkness, the rebels roll the weapons uphill to strategic positions.
They put the guns up on top of Dorchester Heights, which is the highest elevation around Boston. And they put those guns up on top of that hilltop in one night.
Clear skies and a full moon help Washington's troops move quickly. Meanwhile, a thick haze hangs above the city and keeps the redcoats from spotting the moving artillery. On the morning of March 5th, firing position! The British redcoats realize they are in the line of fire from rows of artillery.
That was a jolt and a surprise to the British to wake up and find the Americans had put these guns on Dorchester Heights.
British weapons are unable to fire at the rebels' elevated position. British General William Howe sends a message to Washington. If the British troops are allowed to leave Boston, Howe will not burn down the city. Washington agrees. The redcoats retreat to their ships, and the rebels reclaim the city. Washington's inexperienced army had driven the British from Boston without firing a single shot. But the British fleet doesn't set sail. A cold front causes the wind to die. For days, the British ships sit in the harbor, not making a move. The Americans nervously wait for a change in the weather. Finally, on March 17th, the winds pick up. The redcoats sail out of Boston to the British territory of Halifax, Nova Scotia.
It was quite a stunning defeat, and the Americans were justly proud. Washington was praised to the skies by Congress, and the British, in a sense, had to regroup.
Washington does not have long to celebrate his victory.
They knew they would come back and give us what they felt we deserved. And it was almost certain that they would come back to New York and that they would come back in force.
If the British seize New York, they could essentially split the colonies in two. After a 2-week march through New England, Washington's army arrives in New York City in mid-April. The general establishes his headquarters at the southern tip of Manhattan. His men begin working furiously, building defenses in the city and on Long Island. Then, in August, British ships approach New York Harbor.
They came back with over 400 ships. 400 British ships. Imagine what a sight that was. Imagine what that would do to your morale if you favored the cause of independence and fighting for the glorious future of America.
The ships require 10,000 sailors to operate the rigging and guns. They are also transporting 24,000 ground troops.
To give you a sense of proportion, the largest city in America at the time was Philadelphia, a population of about 34 to 38,000. So this expeditionary force was the size of the largest city in America. One of the riflemen in Long Island said, "I thought all London was afloat." It looked like a forest of pine trees trimmed.
The Continental Army's small fleet of vessels is no match for the British Navy. Defending rivers and ports will be impossible. But Washington stands his ground.
It was a brave and foolish decision. It was a political decision. You couldn't just walk away from New York and let the British have it.
The British set up camp on Staten Island. Washington expects an attack at any moment, but the British generals keep him waiting and watching. July 4th, 1776. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. In full defiance of King George III, The Declaration states that the 13 American colonies are free.
Anyone who signed his name to the Declaration of Independence was declaring himself a traitor and would, if caught, therefore be hanged as a traitor. So it was a very brave step.
About 90 miles away in New York, temperatures are warm and the roads are dry. Washington has divided his forces into roughly equal groups, one on Long Island, the other on Manhattan. The Redcoats make their move on August 22nd. At 5 a.m., British troops begin rowing from Staten Island toward Long Island. When the invasion is complete, 20,000 British forces are assembled on the western side of the island. Washington scrambles to send more troops to Long Island, bringing the American forces there to less than 10,000. Stationed around Brooklyn Heights, the men are about to face an army more than twice their size. On August 26th, British soldiers take advantage of poorly guarded roads and attack from two different directions.
The largest battle of the American Revolution and the first battle in U.S. history, the first battle Americans fought as an independent nation.
More than 800 Americans are captured. 200 are killed or wounded. The Americans scramble to retreat.
The Battle of Long Island was Washington's first great test as a commander, and he failed it badly. He was outsmarted, outflanked, outgeneraled, outnumbered.
The day after the Battle of Long Island, Washington knows his battered troops cannot withstand another assault. Their only way out of Brooklyn is to cross the East River, with British troops and warships close by. While Washington plans a nearly impossible retreat, a vicious storm rolls in, bringing fierce rain and wind.
The whole fate of the army and of the war and of the country was literally in the wind.
After a stunning defeat in the Battle of Long Island, rebel soldiers take another beating, this time from the weather. A strong storm brings high winds from the northeast. Rain drenches the soldiers. General Washington knows the weather will make maneuvers more difficult, but it will also help conceal the movement of his troops. He plans to retreat from Brooklyn after sundown on August 28, 1776.
They rounded up every stray small boat they could find on both sides of the East River and organized what in effect was a makeshift armada of small boats.
The rebels steal away in the dark. The weather changes the field of battle once again when the rain gives way to a thick blanket of fog.
Because the fog was there, it covered this retreat on the Brooklyn side, so the British never saw anything.
By early morning, the last rowboat has crossed the East River. The retreat succeeds without a single loss of life. Only after the skies clear do the British realize they've been duped. And thanks to windy weather, the British have no way of stopping them.
The wind was blowing down from the northeast, which meant, of course, that the British ships in New York Harbor could not sail up into a headwind.
If the wind had changed a day sooner or 2 days sooner, and the British had been able to bring their warships up into the East River, the game would have been up. It would have been over. We probably would all be sipping tea and singing God Saves the Queen. It was a brilliant performance, immediately following what had been a fiasco of command. So the army lived to fight another day.
In November 1776, the rebels lose 2 more battles in the Hudson River Valley. That winter, the Americans set up camp around McConkey's Ferry, Pennsylvania. The soldiers are poorly fed and clothed. Everything is in short supply, from shoes to blankets to food. That, combined with the wintry weather, makes daily life miserable.
The soldiers are in pretty bad shape overall. There's not a resupply for shoes and uniforms to resupply the Army. It's just not there. They're in bad shape.
For weeks, Washington himself had been plagued by doubt.
I do not know what plan of conduct to pursue, and yet I am told that if I quit the command, inevitable ruin will follow.
He felt that he was not sufficient for the job. He knew he was not up to the job, but he knew he was better than anybody else they might have chosen.
In the closing days of 1776, Washington will get a chance to redeem himself and his army. In December 1776, the Continental Army is demoralized by crushing defeats and brutally cold weather. At the end of the month, their one-year tour of duty will be over. The only hope for enlisting new recruits is to gain the upper hand on the battlefield. 9 months earlier, Washington routed the British in Boston, taking advantage of their assumption that maneuvers would stop during the winter months. He hopes that same strategy will work again. The Redcoats are waiting out the winter in New York, but they've posted a group of German mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. These German soldiers are known as Hessians. Washington resolves to launch an attack on Christmas.
Part of Washington's brilliance as a commander was his ability to surprise the British by not obeying that schedule dictated by the weather.
From his position at McConkey's Ferry, Washington plans to cross the frigid Delaware River at 3 points and attack the Hessians in Trenton. One of his commanders will launch troops near Bristol, Pennsylvania. His mission will be to create a diversion and draw the Hessians into the open. Another commander will lead troops across the river to a location near the Hessian camp, blocking a potential escape route. Washington and his troops will cross near McConkey's Ferry and attack Trenton from the north and west. Just before the crossing, a confident Washington writes,
The more we can attack at the same instant, the more confusion we shall spread.
In the late afternoon on Christmas, Washington's troops assemble at the riverbank. As they prepare the boats, a vicious nor'easter approaches.
Nor'easters are the storm makers of the winter season. They're the kind of storms that bring blizzard snows. Sometimes the gusts are above tropical storm force, sometimes above hurricane force.
The snow is coming down. The waters, they're becoming very dangerous because of the high winds.
After the crossing gets underway and into the evening of December 25th, the weather conditions deteriorate. The full brunt of the storm begins to hit at 11 p.m.
As the low pressure system starts to pull down colder air from the north, you start to see the precipitation mixing with sleet and freezing rain, and then eventually changing over to a driving snowstorm.
The famous portrait of Washington's journey does not accurately depict his battle with the elements that night.
Washington crossing the Delaware in a nor'easter standing proudly in his boat probably was not an accurate depiction. It's a romantic one, but with strong winds, very choppy, blustery conditions, you have to figure that the men were pretty well hunkered down.
The storm is so violent that Washington's 2 other commanders and their men cannot complete the crossing. The opposite bank is only about 800 feet away, but it takes roughly 11 hours for all of Washington's troops to reach it. Henry Knox, who is now a general, would later describe the crossing in a letter to his wife.
The floating ice in the river made the labor almost incredible. The night was cold and stormy. It hailed with great violence.
Once across the river, General Washington leads his troops toward the enemy camp in a raging blizzard. Washington's men push through the storm, battling high winds, sleet, and hail. 2 men freeze to death on the journey.
And these howling winds, and hail and sleet and everything else, while making every foot they marched miserable, helped to disguise what was going on.
At dawn on December 26th, Washington and his troops approach the enemy camp at Trenton.
He's gone the offensive, which is a first, really, in a sense. He's been on the defensive and losing battles. Once he gets across the Delaware River here, undetected, the odds are totally in his favor.
The Hessian guards can barely make out the approaching army. They sound the alarm, but it's too late. There's no time to launch an organized defense. In the wet and snowy weather, both sides struggle to fire their guns.
Once these muskets are wet, you're going to have a hard time getting them to spark and fire. As the battle progresses, more and more are misfiring.
The Americans position cannons on higher ground and blast the enemy with artillery fire. The Hessian commander is mortally wounded by a musket blast. 22 Germans are killed.
It wasn't a big battle, it was an engagement. But the fact that we made the British look silly, that we caught the enemy off guard in a very brave, unexpected, dramatic way, worked wonders with the morale, not just of the army, but of the whole country.
After the battle, Washington takes his army back across the Delaware to McConkey's Ferry in Pennsylvania. There, his military advisors urge him to return to Trenton to capitalize on his recent victory. But the year is nearly over. The soldiers' tour of duty will expire on December 31st. And although their surprise attack in Trenton was a huge success, nothing has been resolved. The outcome of the war and the fate of the young country are still in doubt. On December 31st, Washington addresses his troops, imploring them to stay the course. He says, "If you will consent to stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably can never do under any other circumstances. The present is emphatically the crisis which is to decide our destiny." The speech inspires his men to continue the fight. They sign on for another 6 weeks. Even in the British camps, the story of Washington's ambush against the Hessians has become legendary. British General William Howe is furious. He pledges to put an end to the humiliation. Then, abandoning tradition, he orders an attack during winter.
So General Cornwallis is sent down from New York to take command of the initial troops there. And when he arrives on January 1st, he gets information that Washington is back in Trenton, and he orders an attack the next morning.
In Trenton, Washington prepares for another assault by the Redcoats. Warm weather melts the snow and makes the roads muddy, slowing the British advance.
By the time the British arrive in Trenton, Washington has fortified the south bank of the Assunpink Creek.
The creek is swollen with melted snow. Washington knows the only place the British can cross is at the bridge. The Redcoats head for the bridge, where General Washington is waiting with troops and artillery. The British try to rush the bridge 3 times. Each attempt is repelled by a hail of American gunfire.
It's a small action, but very bloody, at the Assunpink Creek Bridge.
At nightfall, British General Charles Cornwallis stops the attack. He tells his troops, "Rest for now. We'll bag the fox in the morning." Washington can't hold off the British assault forever. He needs a way out. Across the creek to the north are the Redcoats. To the west is the treacherous Delaware River. The roads around him are muddy and nearly impassable. Washington looks to the skies. The very lives of his troops will soon depend on his ability to forecast the weather.
If you review the Revolutionary War, there's almost always a fascinating story about the weather and its impact, sometimes a decisive impact on a battle.
On the first evening of 1777, British troops rest in New Jersey after a failed attempt to capture the Assunpink Creek Bridge from American troops. On the south side of the creek, General George Washington plots a nighttime retreat. A midwinter thaw has left the roads muddy, making travel difficult. That night, the temperature plunges. Washington knows that the cloudless night will bring even colder weather. The general senses an opportunity. When one of his spies informs him of an unguarded road nearby, he orders his troops to quickly pack up.
Washington leaving the campfires burning along the creek and enough of the New Jersey militia to tend to these fires. He's going to deceive the British into thinking that he's going to be there in the morning.
As Washington suspected, the falling temperatures quickly freeze the muddy roads, and his troops move swiftly around the sleeping enemy. In the morning, Washington reaches Princeton, New Jersey, where a small group of British soldiers is camped. Muskets fire on both sides. The Americans drive the British out of Princeton. Once again, Washington's ingenuity, combined with his innate sense of the weather, keeps the American Revolution alive. By the summer of 1777, the British are ready to strike back. British General William Howe sails from New York to the Chesapeake Bay with 15,000 men. They march on Philadelphia, the capital city of the new United States. On September 26, 1777, the Redcoats take the capital. That winter, the British house their troops near Philadelphia. 20 miles away, the American army braves the elements in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania.
What you had throughout that encampment was not heavy snow, but sleet, freezing rain, cold rain, constantly coming down and drenching the troops.
But the long winter brings surprising opportunities. In February 1778, a brilliant Prussian military strategist named Friedrich Wilhelm Baron von Steuben arrives in Valley Forge. He sympathizes with the American cause and volunteers his services to Washington. He chooses 100 men to train, and then assigns each one to train a brigade.
Having the spirit of liberty in you goes a long way. But if you don't know how to fire a gun, if you don't know how to march in formation, if you don't know how to be disciplined, all of those other things don't really get you very far.
Form a line of battle to the right.
That spring, the Continental Army leaves Valley Forge a disciplined, well-trained, and loyal fighting force. But they remain vastly outnumbered by the British troops. In May 1778, the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey ends in a draw. But as long as Washington refuses to surrender, the revolution grinds on. The British Empire is weakened. Not only does it face relentless opposition in America, but its ongoing battles with Spain and France have stretched British armed forces to their limit. Now, the Americans urge France to support their cause. France agrees and joins the fight against the British. In the fall of 1781, French military forces arrive in Yorktown, Virginia. On October 9th, the first shots are fired. The combined salvo of U.S. and French artillery is so overpowering, the British can only return fire when the bombardment stops at night. Within a week, British troops led by General Charles Cornwallis are completely surrounded. He plans to evacuate Yorktown by crossing the Bay Inlet to Gloucester Point. But just as the evacuation begins, a severe thunderstorm strikes.
Historians don't seem to know whether this was a hurricane or just some kind of general low-pressure system.
The violent weather stops the British in their tracks, making retreat impossible. Low on ammunition and food, Cornwallis surrenders.
Most people think that the war was pretty well over with the Battle of Yorktown, and that's not far from the truth.
Once again, the weather has played a pivotal role in the course of the American Revolution. Smaller battles and skirmishes continue after Yorktown, but British generals begin to realize they cannot continue to fight the American and French forces. In Paris, ambassadors from both sides negotiate a truce. On September 3rd, 1783, American ambassadors John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay signed the Treaty of Paris. After 8 long and bloody years, America has won its battle for independence, with some critical help from the weather.
The more one studies the Revolutionary War and what really happened, the more one has to conclude that it was a miracle it turned out the way it did.
George Washington stays in command until the last British ship leaves New York Harbor in November 1783.
And when it was over, he gave back his command to the Congress. One of the most important events in our whole story as a nation. The conquering general gives up power.
In the years ahead, his country will call Washington back into service. Then, in retirement, his old ally, Mother Nature, becomes his mortal enemy. General George Washington returns to his Virginia estate in December of 1783. Against all odds, the 51-year-old farmer had changed the course of history. But Washington is eager to put the war behind him and turns his attention to his home, his crops, and his weather journals.
He reinvented the landscape, finished the house, finished the decorations inside the house, and really made Mount Vernon the place that we see it today.
One of his additions is a weather vane on top of the cupola. It is a symbol of peace, a dove holding an olive branch. But the new nation Washington helped create is on rocky ground. When the new Constitution is adopted, Washington is asked to run for office. The war hero wins by a landslide. In 1789, George Washington becomes the first president of the United States of America and serves 2 terms. Then at the age of 65, he refuses to run for a third.
When Washington came back from the presidency, he was admittedly an old man. He predicted that he wasn't going to live for very long.
The weather actually played a major role in Washington's death.
December 12, 1799 begins like many other days at Mount Vernon. Washington spends 5 hours outside, tending to his property. It is cold. A mixture of snow and sleet is falling. When Washington returns home, his clothes are soaked and chilly. The next morning, Washington wakes with a sore throat. He calls for a doctor. George Washington wants to undergo what was a standard medical procedure at the time, bleeding.
The bleeding only makes it worse. Washington soon finds that he can barely breathe at all.
George Washington, the father of our country, dies on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. Today, Washington's weather vane still stands on top of Mount Vernon.
It's a powerful symbol. The weather vane itself, exposed to the elements, reminds me of Washington, because wherever Washington goes, he's exposed to the elements. Whether it's a general fighting in a war or developing agricultural methods at Mount Vernon, the weather is a force in Washington's life.
An awful lot of what happens in life and in history is out of our hands. And most clearly, the weather is part of that. It's a big part of the story and ought to be appreciated.